Okay, so it's my pleasure to introduce this evening, um, uh, a talk which is with a similar name to the society. So it's by Professor Gillen Wood from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. And besides his university day job, he's the author of several books, award-winning books. One was about Tambora, the eruption that changed the world. And another one is Land of Wondrous Cold about Antarctica and unlocking the secrets of its ice, both Princeton University Press, as is his new book, which is called The Wake of the HMS Challenger. And that's the story of tonight's webinar. So over to you, Gillen. And do you want to share your screen now?
Yes, please. Um, let's see. Okay, I'll send a request to you, Phil, for
Yeah, here we go.
the screen.
Yeah,
All right.
great.
It's now the slideshow. All right, can everybody see my screen? Phil,
Yeah,
John.
yeah,
Yeah,
All
yeah.
right. And welcome everyone. Thanks so much for joining me and joining us. It's a sort of banner week for me because 5 years of labor that have gone into the production of this book, the research and the writing of the book, coming to fruition. I'm expecting an advance copy in the mail any day. So this is the um, the front cover to the book, and you're probably curious about elements of the design. Um, the image to the left is by a New Zealand artist who's now a resident in Oban, Scotland, named Alice Strange, who has produced a sort of series of challenges-themed artwork, and which are brilliant and imaginative. And we simply couldn't improve upon one of Alice Strange's uh, artworks as a for the cover design, and Alice kindly agreed to have her work utilized in the cover. So there it is. Um, the title, "The Wake of HMS Challenger: How a Legendary Victorian Voyage Tells the Story of Our Ocean's Decline." It's in the fashion of these sort of rather long-winded subtitles that are descriptive of the contents. But I think the subtitle captures the different approach to the Challenger expedition that I undertook in this book. I'm in our audience here. I'm going to presume that everyone has some sort of outline of the Challenger mission in their minds, and there's certainly among us some real experts, and all of us know that there's a vast literature on the Challenger. So, what does a new book, what could a new book in 2025 bring to the story of the voyage? My After 2 years pondering that question, I decided that I would do what a kind of version of what I'd done in my previous book about the Antarctic voyages of the 1840s, which was to create a kind of split screen in the narrative where one part is devoted to the retelling of the Victorian voyage, and then the other side of the screen switches to our present day oceans. So what we have is a kind of before and after picture, a snapshot of the 1870s ocean provided by Challenger data and reports and narratives. And then through my sort of mining of the present day literature, our present day scientific understanding of ocean science and ocean conditions, setting up for the reader a way of understanding or thinking through what has happened to our global oceans in the past 150 years, and to what extent the Challenger provides this invaluable, indispensable, unique picture of not a pre-industrial ocean utterly, but a sort of early, let's call it an early industrial ocean. So here's the f familiar route of the Challenger. This is taken from Herbert Swire's book, which was published in 1938. Erica Jones, who published a book with Greenwich Museum on the Challenger last year, I think she used this and adapted this, and it's about the best map out there. I think that captures the peregrinations of the Challenger. And again, in my 2 years of pondering how exactly I was going to approach the book, I believe me, I went through a whole litany of quite wacky ideas of how I might do it and do it differently. Should I organize it thematically? Should I organize it by ocean? Um, what could I do? And in the end, I settled for a rather familiar and traditional form, which is chronology. So the book does follow the voyage from Portsmouth to Portugal in around Christmas of 1872. It's it's multiple crossings of the Atlantic in 1872 and 1873. It's crossing into Antarctica and then into the Pacific Ocean. So I do follow it chronologically because with the reader in mind, right? With the reader in mind and realizing that this book, unlike our current audience today, the audience for the book is going to be made up of readers who mostly have no information or very little about the Challenger, that there was a need to keep the narrative organized simply. Um, and just dwelling on that word simply for a moment, I suppose, and, and any of us who've attempted to tackle writing about Challenger in whatever forum before will understand that uh, the great difficulty is dealing with the immensity and complexity of the Challenger legacy. It's 50 volumes of reports. It's immense numbers of sort of paratexts of narratives, ship's logs, diaries, journal entries. It's a kind of Kilimanjaro of a 19th century discovery voyages. And the task is to try to uh, create a narrative from all of that that is digestible within a sort of 75,000 word book, because publishers today aren't looking for book stop style books. They're 70,000, 75,000 words is really the industry limit. And so as an author approaching a retelling of the Challenger story, my first duty was really kind of ruthless selection of what a comprehensive treatment being impossible, what was going to be the principle of ruthless selectivity by which I was going to isolate moments, themes, ideas uh, in the voyage and organize them into a kind of through-going story. This I think this is in Erica's book also. This is a kind of what I suppose glossed up, polished Victorian era illustration of daily life on the Challenger and the inspection of the trawl. Now, I'm sure any of us with the familiarity with Challenger and sort of a kind of fondness for it, uh, we have our own sort of greatest hits list of firsts of the Challenger. Um, and here's you could choose your own greatest hits: the calcite compensation depth, the work on bioluminescence, the discovery of the deal vertical migration, manganese nodules. You could add, well, there are the 5,000 new species. There's so many dimensions, so many threads one could tug at in the Challenger story. And what I didn't want to do is to rehash what has already been done. Obviously, we already have the books dating on Challenger that treat the voyage. So what new could I possibly bring? Here's one of the 50 volumes that features prominently, I get, in all narratives, which is the volume from 1891 by John Murray, The Deep Sea Deposits. So here is where I began, I guess. Well, this is after my 2 years of thinking about it. Was all right. Thinking of discovery voyages, the 18th century, 19th century, sort of a new approach to a kind of refreshed look at these archives, a return to these archives and thinking of them as a kind of data vault for pre-industrial conditions. And as an archive by which we might perform the work of what we call historical ecology, which is to reconstruct past environments. And if I could put a label to what I do, it would be historical ecology, particularly in the 19th century, looking to try to reconstruct ecosystems and environments as they were in the 19th century. So thinking of the Challenger in this context as providing us with baseline data of the pre-industrial or early industrial ocean by which to measure human impacts. What are those human impacts? Again, familiar to us, overfishing, climate change, warming seas, corollary of climate change, ocean acidification, and of course the various ways in which the human waste stream enters into the oceans via toxic wastes, um, discarded gear of different kinds, fishing gear, plastic, microplastics. These emerged in my thought process as I thought through, well, what is a book about Challenger in 2025 on the 150th anniversary? What kind of work should it do? I came more and more insistently to this notion that we should look at environmental change. We should look at change in the oceans and ways of looking at that and as it were refurbishing Challenger and the Challenger archive as a way of thinking through our current ocean crisis. And a shout out to John here. This led me, of course, to looking at ways in which I'm not the first to think of this, obviously, looking at the Challenger archive and thinking ways in which it provides us with a kind of longitudinal framework, a kind of longue durée of data, thinking of it as an original data set and a unique data set from the mid to late 19th century. Here's a paper that John contributed to, what is it, in 2012, looking at the temperature data sets from today and in the 1870s. And another very interesting one that plays a role in one of my chapters, chapter 2, where I write about focus on foraminifera. And this very interesting piece, and I've had conversations with Giles Miller, one of the authors here, about the effect of ocean acidification on calcifying plankton. And if you see in the abstract there, the finding was that the like drilling again at a place where Challenger had been and drawn up deposits, deep sea deposits that the shells of the foraminifera are up to 70%, 76% thinner owing to increased acidification. So it's this in the spirit of these kinds of papers, this kind of literature that's emerging from revisiting the Challenger archive that I embarked on my book, and we I have there's a question from Mark. I'm quite happy to take questions as we go. Yeah.
Go ahead, Mark. You should be able to talk.
Oh, Mark, you're muted. Do you want to
You got your
unmute?
microphone switched off.
Looks like he's still muted. So I might just continue and maybe take questions in a little while. So from the Wallace Stevens poem, The 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird, I conceived this idea of 13 ways of looking at HMS Challenger. And what does this list of chapter subjects represent? As I said, ruthless selection. And taking species, what were my, I thought of this as kind of, what we used to do in school with the Venn diagrams, and thinking about, well, what are my criteria for selection? Or thinking about, well, certainly charismatic sea creatures would be um, in one part of the Venn diagram and one of the circles. Also, uh, sea creatures or sea, that about which there was a kind of paper trail. There is some sort of scientific literature for me to use, um, and on which both the Challenger scientists had written, but was also present in the marine scientific literature today. So providing me material to write about. And so here's the list of, obviously there were thousands of items to choose from, but so I have a chapter that focuses on the brittle star of your museum. Um, a chapter, as I said before, chapter 2 is about foraminifera, focuses on that. And Chapter 3, where Challenger is in St. Thomas and the Virgin Islands, focuses logically on corals. Uh, Chapter 4 on the sargassum weed. Chapter 5 is more not so much focused on a specific marine animal, but rather on as I say, phylogenetic traits, on bioluminescence, the phenomenon of camouflage, which was fascinating to the Challenger scientists and on which they wrote expansively. Uh, Chapter 6 takes us into the Antarctic Ocean, and where this chapter is really where John Buchanan, the chemist aboard HMS Challenger, really takes center stage. So I write a good deal about uh, his publications on ocean chemistry, as well as talking, as I say here, about cephalopods and jellies. Chapter 7 takes us to Australia, um, and oysters, mollusks. Uh, Chapter 8 to the Euplectellum glass sea sponge in the Philippines. Chapter 9, of course, what would a Challenger book be without an episode on the Challenger Deep? I treat that in chapter 9. Chapter 10 takes us to Japan. And if you might have noticed thus far, and by the time I get to chapter 10, I'm already thinking as an author, well, I haven't really talked about many fish um, uh, per se. So it was overdue for a chapter on fish and a chapter that dealt with the issue with overfishing in particular. And so that is the Japan chapter, talking about salmon. Chapter 11, of course, again, what would a Challenger book be without the Bathybius episode? And you might say, why wait until chapter 11? Well, there's a good reason for that. It's because it was in Japan, or really just as they were leaving Japan, that Murray and Buchanan presented Thompson with the evidence that Bathybius was a kind of mistake of the laboratory. And Thompson was presented with this rather difficult situation where he had to write to Huxley and say, look, it's all wrong and we need to sort of correct the record. So it belongs there at that moment in the voyage out of Japan. That the passage from Japan through to Hawaii and then to Tahiti also spells the demise of the junior scientist Rudolf Wilhelmus. So the episodes surrounding his death occurs in chapter 11. And I also look, as you see in the list of, I take that opportunity to talk about Wilhelmus' final publication, which was on barnacles, and to so um, that appears in chapter 11. And also, of course, he was killed by the Streptococcus bacteria, so it's an opportunity to talk about the bacteria in the oceans. Chapter 12 is also, and obviously, a very important part of the story, which is the manganese nodules. These were first encountered and collected in the Atlantic Ocean, but it's in the Pacific Ocean that challenges really begin, they begin to understand the full scope and extent of the manganese nodule phenomenon on the sea floor as they cruise through the Central Pacific. And the the title page of the volume from 1991 of Deep Sea Deposits, called one of their most important breakthrough publications of Challenger, features in this chapter. And then, of course, we're nearing the end. It's the final crossing into the Atlantic via Patagonia to and then the final crossing of the Atlantic, stopping at Ascension Island, and that's the final stop for the book. Ascension Island, the run by the Royal Navy, and its little economy was built around uh, the harvesting of green turtles. And this is an opportunity for me to talk about the long-term impact of European presence in the oceans and the near extinction of green turtles over that period. So we end with a kind of charismatic reptile. That's where I chose to go. Um, so these were the choices that were made. These were the particular um, the foci of each of the 13 chapters. Now, this is what I'm going to do here is kind of go over that again and just uh, show you how a sense of how the book is illustrated and the discussions that I had with the designer of the book about how I wanted each of these chapters to be uh, presented. Um, and if you can imagine, this is a brittle star. This is the Ophiomysium Lymani, which is the focus of the first chapter. If you can imagine this on the facing page of the chapter, and on the right page is the chapter title, the chapter heading, the chapter title, and the text begins. So when you, and I hope you all of you will read the book. I know Christmas will soon be upon us, and this will be an ideal present. But so if you imagine, as the reader, you have the text on the right page, and on the facing page, you have an image of the creature that will be featured in the chapter. In this case, the brittle star. And you see, and this was the tricky bit from the point of view of design, was you'll see, and it will actually look better in the final product. Um, there was some glitch involved in my creating a PDF of this. But there's in the inset, you'll see there's a map. And I talked before about deciding, after much prevarication, that I would do this. Um, I follow the line of least resistance and organize the narrative chronologically. So this first chapter, this facing page tells the reader this first chapter will deal. That will be bound chronologically by the departure from Portsmouth around Christmas 1872, the the arrival in Lisbon, and then take us to Gibraltar. So it's really just kind of the opening episode of the Challenger mission that will be treated in this chapter. Right? I mean, I guess after decades, perhaps 2 decades of writing popular science for a general audience, I have this idea of sort of simplicity and comprehensibility very much in mind. How can I make it, as how can I make very complex material as legible as possible for the average educated reader who comes to the story with a minimum amount of some curiosity and a minimum amount of information. So trying to present it as clearly as possible. So in this chapter to come, I'll be writing about this period of time. The Challenger will be covering. This is the first leg of the journey, and here's the creature um, who'll be discussed in the chapter. And in the end, the story of Ophiomysium, it ends up being about microplastics and the deadly impact of a seabed littered with microplastics on brittle stars, who of course um, feed on microplankton in the water column and across the seabed, and microplastics represent a real threat to them. Chapter 2. Okay, so if you look at the little inset map, takes us from Madeira through Tenerife and across to St. Thomas. And John Murray is the star of this chapter. And the trawling for deposits from the seabed. and his the remarkable work that he does on foraminifera in that chapter. And uh, earlier, I referenced the publication that came out maybe a decade ago by Giles Miller and his colleagues at the Natural History Museum on the threat of ocean that ocean acidification represents to um, calcite shelled um, plankton. So that becomes the kind of theme for that chapter. And as you'll know, by my brief descriptions, you'll see that I'm establishing early on in the book this kind of before and after picture, looking at specific marine creatures, right? Telling the story through the eyes of the challenger, through their trawling, their work in the laboratory on the Challenger, and then their subsequent publications over the 20 years following the return of the Challenger, looking at all of those in a kind of aggregate, creating a narrative of that, and then a pivot um, toward present day. What is the status of these creatures in the early 20th century oceans? What do we know about the changes and the challenges in ocean conditions that these creatures face? So, uh, chapter three takes us to is a chapter in which I think there's a phrase that I use in the story in the narrative where I say that the oceans that the challengers sail on are not our oceans. And it's no better exemplified than in chapter three, where the challengers were confronted with a coral ecology dominated by acropora corals, the staghorn and the elkhorn corals, and did much sort of early work on analysis. And Henry Moseley has publications, for instance, on the acropora, and these are 90% gone. So literally decimated. So much to be said clearly about a before and after when it comes to corals. And you might just look at the my description of the figure, um, and that my first thought was that all of the illustrations would come from the uh, the challenge reports, given that they're, as we all know, that they're so richly illustrated, right? But it turned out once I'd made the selection of the marine life that I wanted to sort of spotlight in the book, that the best 19th century period illustrations did not always come from the Challenger reports. So that particular sort of, ideal that I had or ambition that I had was not realized, and I ended up using illustrations that came from different sources. And in this case, this is the elkhorn coral Acropora palmata, and so the illustration comes from a publication from Harvard in 1880. Um, Chapter four takes us into the Sargasso Sea, and the of course the challengers who were the scientists who had mostly been almost exclusively exposed to the sargassum weed through desiccated, dried specimens have been brought back to the UK. Were actually able to encounter the sort of living, breathing uh, sargassum weed, the kind of seabed, the sea prairie of the weed. It was an extraordinary experience for them. They spent a good period of time in it and studying it. And the pivot in this chapter to our current day problem is the fact that the Sargassum Sea seems, and the Sargassum weed seems to be proliferating at an exponential rate. Warming ocean conditions are productive of the weed, and so it's become a kind of ecological threat itself. There's a great expansion of the seaweed. Chapter five, as I mentioned before, it's more about the challenger's interest in behavioral patterns of behavioral traits that they see, and their the astonishing phenomenon of bioluminescence, which is, of course, not new to the challenges. Um, since time immemorial, mariners have been confronted by this extraordinary phenomenon of bioluminescence, and I look into the challenges, thoughts about it, and also about other aspects of camouflage, of self-protection, the predator-prey relationships that Challenger began to think through. One of them is the deep sea lobster, which they really couldn't understand why a deep sea lobster, which they were surprised to find in their trawling nets, was coloured this sort of beautiful crimson, and Wyville Thompson wondered why, that the divine design has settled on this gorgeous color for a creature which no one could appreciate in the deep sea. Of course, we know now that the color red in the deep sea is in fact a kind of perfect kind of camouflage color for a deep sea creature, and ends with the sole specimen. The chapter ends in Brazil with the sole specimen of a seahorse that was recovered through the entire 4-year voyage, a single seahorse from the coast of Brazil. And there's a little episode at the end of this chapter which is devoted to the um, the fate of um, the fate of the seahorse as a common bycatch of the shrimp industry, and it's the threats posed to it, and also by Chinese herbal medicine, which prizes the seahorse. Now, at this point, I'm sort of halfway through my chapters, and I'm I like to invite sort of questions, and now you get a sense of what I'm attempting to do with the book and how I'm taking, the organization of the book and really the thesis behind it. Please feel free to interject, to ask questions as we go, as I take you through this kind of highlight reel of the book. And now the map, as you see, we're now into the Antarctic Ocean, and the long, perilous leg. We almost lost the Challenger on one particular storm in the Antarctic Ocean. There was a collision with an iceberg. That it's All of this was very close to being, it was never reaching the starting gate that everything would have been sunk with all hands, and we never would have had the Challenger reports. We never would have had any of it. But luckily, they escaped and made their way to Melbourne. When they get to Sydney, which is, of course, Sydney and Melbourne, this is my home turf. This was an interesting moment for me in researching Challenger to be surprised and to have to readjust my own or, historical paradigm, and to think about the 1870s and the Challenger as by no means a kind of pristine ocean, but rather not a pre-industrial ocean, but an early industrial ocean. Of course, the history of 18th and 19th century sealing and whaling is well known. So clearly, the human impacts on the ocean of these large mammals was already significant. But it's probably, it's less known that the human impact of the harvesting of oyster beds, of naturally occurring oyster beds on the coastlines of the New World, was already so advanced. This came as somewhat of a surprise to me that already by the 1870s you have sort of a massive industrial level depletion of natural oyster beds in Sydney Harbour and its environs. So this chapter um, takes the fabled Trigonia shell as its starting point. And for those not who don't know the Trigonia story, it was a kind of um, holy grail of mid-19th century science because it was seen as a link because Trigonia fossils had been discovered. It was seen that, well, there's a link to the deep evolutionary past. Um, and there was an idea that a Trigonia shell, a modern Trigonia shell, could be found. It would be proof of a kind of continuity of life. Um, and indeed, Trigonia shells were found in the Southern Hemisphere, in Australia, and the so challenges were in this sense late on the scene of the whole debate surrounding the Trigonia. So I begin the chapter there, and then segue into this issue of like oyster harvesting at large, and it's the kind of the fact that our oceans again are not challenges oceans, and that we're looking at oceans which are and oyster beds that have been decimated worldwide. Another holy grail of the 19th century science was the beautiful, enigmatic glass sea sponge, the so-called Venus flower basket. And Wyville Thompson had his eye on a living specimen of the Venus flower basket from the very beginning. And sure enough, when they get to the Philippines, they enlist local fishermen who have a knowledge of the specific locations for the Euplectella to take them there. And they, on one sort of very significant morning, they trawl that bed and bring up a dozen or more of these glass sea sponges. So it's an opportunity for me to do more work in um, uh, detailing for the reader this very interesting episode in 19th century science, in which there's a great deal of uh, amazement, wonderment, investigation into exactly what a glassy sponge was. It the first theory was from the Royal Society was that it had been constructed by the creatures that lived within it. And of course, we know different now. And uh, the the glassy sponge continues to be an object of fascination, of course, for us. It's and in the domain of biomimicry science, like what we can learn from nature's most exquisite and complicated constructions. Uh, there's a real interest in the glassy sponge now as a kind of perfected by 500 million years of evolution, what it can tell us about design and hydroengineering. So we're getting near we're getting near to the end when I will, I'm glad want to open this up for a discussion. We know about the Challenger Deep and how what a fluke it was that the Challengers arrived at this location. They simply really drifted there. They were out of fuel and there was no wind. It was one of the most tedious legs of the entire voyage, and they ended up in this near Guam. And the that day where they trawled 5 miles deep and repeated the process because they couldn't quite believe it. And there have the Challenger Deep has now been visited by a handful of submersibles where trash has been found. So this becomes a kind of fable, I guess, for us in the 21st century that there even the remotest deep in the remotest ocean on Earth is the human footprint is present. There's no part of the planet that is untouched. As I said earlier, um, what would a book about the global oceans be with without like a real engagement with Asia and the of course which is the home for the most significant global fisheries in the world and has been. And the challenges, the most significant encounter for them was their long stay in Japan, and which was the one time, and this is here we are. Here I am, 40 minutes into a talk on Challenger, and I hadn't really talked about colonialism. Um, and so let me say now that, as I say in my introduction to the book, colonialism and uh, the British global maritime dominion, let's call it, is the setting for the book, but it's not the subject of the book. It's always apparent the fact that uh, the Britain's global maritime infrastructure enabled the Challenger mission is obvious in everywhere in the book. But the I set out my purpose in setting in writing the book is not to simply retell the Challenger story according to those lights, or to tell a story about colonialism, but rather my impulse and my priority was kind of biocentrism. To if that hasn't been obvious already, let me just reinforce this idea. I was interested in focusing on marine life, marine creatures, on ocean conditions, shifting the focus away, as it from the human actors and shifting it toward marine life. Right? This is my priority in the book. So there's a long way of getting to this point about colonialism and the Challenger, and arriving in Japan at a sort of at such a crucial turning point in the history of Japan when it's in sort of involuntary opening up to the West due to the sort of gunboat diplomacy of the Americans. And But it being it being a complicated colonial encounter for the challengers, in that um, their prejudices were challenged because they saw in the Japanese and in Japanese culture and an extraordinarily advanced culture and civilization that they was in many ways, including in its fisheries, superior um, to European culture and industry. And this was rather sobering to the challenges. So it's a rather, I think I took great pleasure in in the Japan episodes, rather unique, and has not really been written about in full, I feel. So I think, it's one of my favorite parts of the book was to be able to really write about the challenges in Japan. And also, this was the opportunity. I said earlier that there seems to be a deficit of actual fish. In my book, here was an opportunity to talk about the evolution of the global fishery from the 1870s. And the moment that the Challenger arrived is, in fact, the beginning point. It's the origin of the modern uh, Japanese fishery. We can see it's beginning to emerge when by the mid 20th century, it was the dominant fishery in the globe, across the globe. So a lot to work through and think through in that chapter. I mentioned the Bathybius story and the death of William which is the subject of the Pacific chapter. Manganese nodules, of course, they're one of the highlights, obviously, in anyone's account of the expedition, the 1891 Deep Sea Deposits volume, the beautiful illustrations. And this is an opportunity, of course, for me to write about deep sea mining, a live and controversial issue for all of us who care about the oceans and research and think about the oceans. And so there's obviously a very large current literature on polymetallic nodules and deep sea mining, and this is my opportunity to write about that particular threat to the 21st century oceans. And finally, it writing about the turtles enabled me to end on with a sort of memorable, charismatic reptile, and also one that speaks to the 500-year presence of European um, colonialism, fishing, the maritime presence over the last 500 years. Columbus, when he first in the Caribbean waters, they had to actually sort of decrease sail and slow the vessel down because of the swarms of migrating turtles. And the estimates are that there were from 70 to 80 million turtles, sea turtles in the it's green turtles um, in the Atlantic Ocean in the pre-colonial period was reduced to a remnant population of maybe tens or several hundred thousand by the time even by the late 19th century. So this is a reminder that the challenges, we're not sailing through a pristine ocean by any measure, and that there were large-scale human impacts um, that the ocean life was already absorbing and adapting to. Right. Well, that's my 40 odd minutes up. My experience of Zoom lectures is that no one is interested in being talked at for more than about that length of time. So I want to um, thank you for your attention. This is my sort of brief tour of the book, and just to leave you with a couple of images that didn't make it into the book. As I was writing the book, I was always imagining that the front cover would be the Wyville Thompson Challenger windows from St. Michael's Church in Linlithgow. These beautiful, but it never made it into the book. So here are some images you won't see um, in in my Challenger book, but of course, we can still take delight in them. They're very beautiful, and I when I came to Scotland, I made sure to make the pilgrimage to this church and to see the windows. They're very beautiful. So thank you very much, and please let's open it up to discussion, and I'm happy to talk about any aspect of this.
Thanks, Gillen. Philip Pearson had a question. So, Philip, set your microphone to unmute your microphone. Okay. Anyway, he was asking, did they first find a Venus flower basket off Gibraltar?
Hello, I've got my mic
Oh, here
going.
we go. Yeah.
Oh, hi, Philip. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, Gillen. It's really lovely talk. I'm so pleased to be able to join this. It's a real privilege and fascinating things that your structure of your talk. This may be a daft question. I've got it in my head somehow, and I can't track it down. That they actually found the Venus flower basket off Gibraltar quite early on. Is that
Yeah.
is that complete rubbish?
It's partially right. You're partially right, Philip. And first of all, let me say that, it's been great talking about this project with you over the last several years, and it was great to meet you. What year, when was it? 2022 or
Yeah,
so,
it was.
and
Yeah,
at the NHM, and to be, to have
yeah,
you
yeah.
as an interlocutor, and that's it's terrific. And I'm of course I'm very glad, to have had your book and now my book coming out, and I hope that, collectively we can feel as if we're marking the 150th anniversary
Yeah.
fully and in a satisfying way. Because I think we look back to 1972, the 100th anniversary, and there, have we met that? Have we met our moment? There was certainly a lot written and done about Challenger to mark that occasion, and I hope that we can feel collectively that we've done our best to mark the 150th, and we look ahead to what the 200th might hold, but that's someone else's problem. So
Yeah.
yeah, so well, just to answer your question, there was a glass sponge indeed. Um, but not this specific one, not the specific Venus flower basket. So yeah, partially right, Philip. So yes, off Gibraltar, a glassy sponge, but not the one that they were all wanting. And the flower basket, which had been um, first sent back to Britain in 1841, and Richard Owen was the first to describe it and publish on it. And had been well, it had become a popular phenomenon, and there'd been a rush on it, like Dutch tulips. The cost of a Venus flower basket was in was uh, crazy, exorbitant, and very popular among collectors in Europe. but just about the time that the Challengers arrived, that kind of the what would we call it? The fad for the Venus Fire Basket was sort of tapering off, and the value of had crashed from I've forgotten what had crashed to about £5 from like £500, and because most of the collectors had them. And I guess it's one of the melancholy notes that I found myself sounding again and again through the book was that the Challengers arrived there. They met, they had that day on the at this particular place in the Philippines, uh, the bed of glassy sponges, and they got their samples. But within a few years, that bed had disappeared, and
Yeah,
it
I
had been
read about that. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, exactly as you know, it had been fully harvested and
Mm,
was gone.
mm.
Yeah.
Um,
Oh,
sorry to,
Philip.
it's a bit tedious, but where is the blooming reference to this thing being found off Gibraltar?
Oh,
I, it
that,
just,
oh, that's deep in the weeds, Philip. I
is it
can,
all right?
yeah,
Okay.
it's there. It's there. We,
Oh,
it's, oof.
don't worry.
Well,
It's
it would be in the essay on the glassy sponges in the reports. So yeah, it would have that.
yeah. All right.
Yeah,
I'll
it,
look.
you could,
Okay.
yeah, yeah, you find it there.
Yeah. Thank you
Um,
for that.
yeah, thanks, Philip. It's
Okay.
great to hear from you. Thanks.
Just a reminder, if you want to ask a question, just raise your hand or put something in the chat. Mark, just before John asks his, Mark, did you have a question? Or if you did, unmute your microphone. Okay. John, what's
Well, I thoroughly enjoyed that talk, and what an imaginative way of distilling this vast quantity of information into 13 chap 13 themed chapters. And as I was listening to it, I was thinking of other themes that one might
Yeah,
talk about the way in which the ocean has changed. And what one obviously is very close to my heart, and the fact that the changing salinity of the surface of the ocean, as we know now, has an impact not just within the ocean, but actually within the whole of the global atmosphere, and and has an impact on droughts and floods throughout the world. The other thing that suddenly struck me was that Challenger sailed in a very different political ocean. Challenger was actually free to go and make measurements virtually wherever it wanted to, and of whatever kind. Researchers today are hemmed in by regulation and by uh, people's ownership, countries' ownership of the world, of the oceans around them, and that, you know, Challenger had an easy time of it. Technologically, it was difficult for them, but politically, it was a hell of a sight easier.
yeah. Um, uh, yeah, you're absolutely right. Two very interesting points. Well, first of all, the point that one could start this project again,
Yeah,
choose 13 different marine phenomena, 13 different themes. It was the what occurred to me and what appeared, the material that presented itself to me at the time. So yeah, it's I guess a kind of iterable project. And with at the basis of it is a recognition that the vastness of the archive, right? It's
mm,
just like a reality. It's like it's the archive meets reality. But yeah, the salinity question, it's like I mean, John Buchanan's salinity map of the oceans is really a remarkable artifact. And I do to reference that in the
yeah,
chapter 6, and this makes some tribute to that map.
yeah.
It's but that's that would be worth a chapter unto itself, wouldn't it? Wouldn't that be would that be a good chapter to write? And maybe there'll be spin-offs here. I hope there will be spin-offs. Um, and the other point that you made about the kind of free license of the oceans that Challenger enjoyed. It struck me talking to various specialists uh, in various sort of areas of marine biology that who reminded me that in some cases, in when it comes to some species, challenges samples are the only ones we have. Many places that or a significant fraction of the locales that where Challenger sounded and and trawled have never been revisited. And the sole data point that we have is Challenger's data point, which is remarkable to think of, and also brings us back to the very genesis of the expedition, which is the philosophers ask, right? The first question in philosophy, why is there something rather than nothing? In this case, how did Challenger, why did this mission happen or instead of not happening? And I don't have a complete answer to that, except that you had some well-placed marine scientists with and a kind who were able to lobby the government, and even on the basis of like a 1 or 2 page research proposal, had full use of a warship for 4 years. And that it was kind of a one. The Challenger was, as we know, a kind of one-off, and it had did not, although I said before that it was a product, or it took advantage of the infrastructure of 19th century trade and colonially administered trading routes, but it did by no means keep to those routes. Huh? It wandered away, and I think that, there's great credit to Thompson and the masterminds of the expedition that they took those risks and they allowed themselves to kind of drift into unpopulated, untraversed corners of the ocean. And we have data from there that we would not otherwise have.
Okay. I had a question about the green turtles. I
Oh,
mean, many of the things from Challenger that you've highlighted are quite depressing, aren't they? Things like plastics and so on.
yeah.
But the green turtles now seem to me to be doing okay. I mean, I've been to Ascension and seen thousands of the things myself.
Yeah.
They're just not farmed anymore. They're doing okay. So that's a kind of an optimistic thing
Yeah.
that maybe if the world got its act together, then we could, recover from it.
Yeah. I'm glad you mentioned that. Um, and yeah, I'd like to talk to you about your Ascension experience sometime. Um, it's so yeah, when I teach environmental writing at my university, I created a program called, in environmental writing where I try and teach what I do. And one of the things that I talk about with my students is um, providing in our narratives of of environmental history or environmental issues a kind of note of hope, a kind of solution trajectory, or that doom and gloom narratives um, ultimately can be disempowering to a reader, to the audience.
Yeah.
To dwell on the melancholy and to sort of stay in the elegiac mode, which can be the real temptation, right? There's so much reason to sort of stay in this sort of style of elegy. We have to, as writers, it's important, and messengers, I guess, communicators. It's important to try, to find some way out of the elegiac mode, and to look at, well, what kind to empower the reader to think what can be done. Are there ways out of this? Can we improve? And so I do, the moment one of the reasons I chose the Green Turtles to conclude with was that I'm able to pivot at the very end to what you're just saying, which is that they're, with some amount of regulation on Green Turtles, right, for 50 years or more, and the heroic work of volunteers in helping um, with turtles and their reproduction habitats, so with beaches. Um, And with that combination has led to a rebound, kind of unexpected rebound in green turtle numbers, whether it's the Indian Ocean or the Atlantic Ocean. There has been, and they're apparently now in ascension. The numbers have returned to almost what they were before 1810,
Wow.
or
Okay.
when the Navy took it over.
Yeah.
So, it is a little, like you say, like a bit of light, for the reader to think about. It's like, wow, just with some good volunteer work, dedicated volunteer work, and some regulation, we can see these populations adapt and rebound. Yeah, no, a good
Yeah.
point, Philip. Thanks for
Okay.
raising.
Um, okay. Well, Gillen, I just like, if nobody else is raising their hand, I'd just like to thank you for spending the time
Of course.
talking to us. How much is your book in the UK, by the way?
Oh, you mean pounds? How much does it
Yeah.
cost? Uh, that's a good question. It's on Amazon. You can
Yeah.
pre-order
Oh,
on
right. Okay.
Amazon.
Right.
But I can tell you the US dollars, they have to keep it under 30. That's the
Yeah.
whole thing.
Well,
Right. So it's 29.95 in US dollars. I think it's around 20 pounds. So
okay. Right.
yeah. But
Okay. Thank you. I'm going to end the recording now then.
all right. Well, thanks everyone. I appreciate the chance to talk to you all.
Thank you. Um, oh, hang on.